Alright, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Clean coming at you guys here with the long-awaited review of Fire Emblem Engage. I'm sorry I didn't get this out sooner. I got very sick after I was done with my marathon streaming, and I took several days just to recover. I think I'm getting old, guys. But in this video, I'm going to pour my heart out regarding the new Fire Emblem game. I'm going to give you guys my opinions, the things I liked, the things I didn't like. We're going to get into the game mechanics, the story, the music, everything. However, because I don't like wasting your time, I'm going to just start off this video with just a general opinion on the game, because I imagine a lot of you guys clicked on this video just wanting to know whether or not the game is any good and whether or not you should buy it. And let me just say right off the bat, yes. Yes, the game is good, and yes, you should absolutely buy it. It is a very solid Fire Emblem game. I think you're going to enjoy it. I think you're going to have a lot of fun with it. I enjoyed it greatly, and I think you will too. So, if you're just looking for a general opinion on whether or not this is a good Fire Emblem game, there you have it. I can absolutely recommend it. This is a banger. I enjoyed this game on par with how much I enjoyed Fire Emblem Fates in terms of pure gameplay. I am, of course, going to get a lot more in-depth. If that is what you want, then you can keep watching. But if you just wanted to know whether the game was good or not, you have your answer. Anyway, for the rest of you, let us take a deep dive into this latest installment, shall we? So, full disclosure here, this review is coming from someone who has beaten the game only once. I have not started my second playthrough of the game yet. I do think that in order to make a proper review, you need to play this game at least twice, if not 3 times. It is a very complex Fire Emblem game that takes a lot of time to master. And I think this is going to be one of those games that gets more fun the more you play it. The replayability of this game is off the charts, and I am already excited to go into my second playthrough. So if this is something that you've been worried about, let me put you at ease. I think this is a game that you can sink hundreds of hours into, and you're definitely going to get a bang for your buck. Now, as for me, I beat the first playthrough on hard mode. I decided to not go maddening on my very first playthrough because I wanted to play around and have fun. And I streamed the whole playthrough on this very channel. There's links in the video description if you want to go check it out. Overall, it took me 5 streams and around 50 hours to beat my first playthrough. This game has 26 chapters in total and 15 optional paralogues, and I think I beat around 5 or 6 of them, so I did roughly 1/3 of the optional content, and it took me around 50 hours to beat the game. You have to subtract a couple of hours that I spent talking to my chat, reading questions, and doing meme review and all that stuff, but I think it's fair to say that on a casual playthrough, you can spend anywhere between 40 to 50 to maybe 55 hours. However, if you decide to complete everything that this game has to offer, we're talking all the optional stuff, all the paralogues, all the minigames, watch all the supports, I think a playthrough can very easily reach 100 hours. But that is if you go out of your way to do everything that this game has to offer. I do think that's a mistake though, because this is a game that really should be played multiple times. The mechanics are very complex, and the gameplay is very rewarding once you figure it out. The skill ceiling of this game is through the roof, let me tell you. One thing I noticed while playing through this game is just how insane your strategies can be if you plan ahead. And I very much think that once people really start to figure this game out, they'll be able to breeze through maddening. Maybe they'll even be forced to bring in a 4th higher difficulty, because let me tell you, this game can be broken already, and people haven't even begun to figure it out properly yet. It's going to be very fun to see what people can pull off once they really start to master the game. So yeah, I really wanted to start off the video by saying that. Please treat this as more of like a first opinion review rather than an in-depth analysis, because I have only played this game once. I will start my second playthrough soon, but I'm still relatively new to this game, and I can only really offer my first impressions. Although I do have a lot of Fire Emblem experience under my belt, so I do think that I'll be able to give you guys some decent analysis on the game despite only having played it once. So before we get into the broader topics of this video, I just want to get a couple things off my chest. The first is I'm going to be saving all the spoilers in this video to the last. So if you just want to see someone talk about this game, but you don't want to know what happens, who the final boss is, you know, big plot points, twists, stuff like that. So when that begins, I'm going to ask you guys to click off the video so you don't get yourself spoiled. For the rest of you, you can continue watching until this timestamp, so just be aware of that. There's going to be timestamps in the video description. I'm going to neatly organize this video into chapters, so you guys won't be taken by surprise by this, I promise. Also, I'm just going to praise this game a little bit. I will be critical later on, but I just want to get this off my chest. This game feels amazing to play. It is so much fun. The animations are absolutely masterful. This is something that I was able to deduce simply by watching the trailers, but once I got my hands on this game and I played it myself, I can absolutely say this is some of the most fun I've had playing Fire Emblem. This game runs amazingly. The animations are flashy and very fun to watch, similar to how they used to be back in the GBA era. They have sort of like the smoothness of modern Fire Emblem, but they also have a weight to them that they haven't had in a while. One of my biggest criticisms when it comes to the animations of Fire Emblem Fates and Fire Emblem Awakening is that while they flow smoothly, they lack impact. It feels like the characters weigh nothing, they just float around like they're walking on clouds, whereas now you can really feel the crunch when someone hits your Armor Knight. You can really feel the impact when your arrows hit a flyer. This game makes very satisfying sounds, and the combat animations do not get boring. I didn't even speed the game up most of the time because I just thought the animations were so pretty to look at. So let me just say this game feels great to play, and it is an absolutely amazing experience. You will not be disappointed. However, there are things about this game that I didn't like, that I'm going to get into later, like the story. I was not a big fan of the story. I think most people who tuned in saw that very clearly. At times, it did feel like I was almost entirely just making fun of it, but that's because I really don't think that they focused much on this story as a whole. It was clear that the developers of Engage just wanted to make a fun Fire Emblem game, and they just didn't really focus much on the story department. I would say that they're pretty much just recycling what has worked from other modern Fire Emblem games. The story is very similar to Awakening and how it feels and how it progresses, but I feel like even Awakening put more effort into its story than this game does. Again, I'm going to be talking a lot more about this in the story section. For now, let's just get into the first topic, which is gameplay mechanics. So let's start off by talking a little bit about the gameplay, shall we? One of the things that I was worried going into Engage was that it wasn't going to feel like Fire Emblem, but I can absolutely assure you it feels like Fire Emblem. Whenever I play it, I definitely feel like I'm in a Fire Emblem game. There's a lot of new mechanics and there's a lot of new rules that you have to adjust to, but at its core, the gameplay feels like Fire Emblem. If I were to compare it to an older entry, I would definitely say that it reminds me the most of Fire Emblem Fates, especially considering weapons do not have durability, so the resource management of this game is a little lower than that of the other games. However, you still have things like staves, vulneraries, tonics, and other resources that you need to manage. Gold isn't the only thing you need to collect in this game, you also have another resource called bond fragments, and also tons of other little resources that you will use in crafting and whatnot. But overall, this game feels like Fire Emblem at its core, and that is a very good thing. However, there is one thing that sets this game apart from most other games in the series, and that is the fact that movement is a lot lower in Engage compared to other Fire Emblem games. Infantry units, on average, have 4 move. Cavalry have 6. Whenever a unit promotes to an advanced class, it usually gets 1 extra point of movement. To compensate for this, maps seem to be a lot smaller. There are some big maps in the game, but on average, many of them are a lot smaller than what we're used to. And I will say, I think I would have enjoyed this game more if they just slapped +1 move on every single class in the game and called it a day. Obviously, it would mess with enemy placement. Obviously, they need to redesign that, and some of the maps would feel very small. You'd be able to traverse them very quickly. But on average, I felt that this was the biggest source of annoyance for me, because I always felt that I wasn't quite in range of what I wanted to reach. 4 move just doesn't feel very good. I think that this was a conscious choice that they did to make the game feel more similar to Heroes. I think that their goal with Engage was to drag Heroes players into the mainline franchise, and that's why they tried to limit movement, because when you limit movement, you do simplify the game. Now, this game is super complex. I'm not saying it's simple, but lowering movement does make the game easier, because there's less variables to account for. Now, there are, of course, tons of different ways that you can increase your mobility in Engage if you know where to look. The Sigurd Ring, which the game gives you very early on, will give you a huge boost to movement when you equip it. You have skills like reposition, you do eventually get a dancer, and there are just ways that you can make your characters traverse the map very quickly if you know how to exploit the game. And this game is very exploitable. It has a ton of things that you can unlock, and once you do unlock these skills, it feels very rewarding, because without them, it kind of feels like you're crawling through the mud sometimes, but when you get these skills, you are suddenly in range of what you want to attack, and it feels super great. As I said, I think I would have enjoyed it if they just slapped +1 extra movement on every single class and called it a day, but I kinda understand why they didn't. They definitely would have to redesign a lot of the game if this was the case. So myself, I was a little bothered by the low movement, but there are certainly ways to work around that, and I think the game very much intends for you to do it. Now, as for the break mechanic, another mechanic that I was very curious about, it definitely dominates a big part of the gameplay, but it felt a lot less intrusive than I thought it would. Now, if you don't know, the break mechanic is basically this game's weapon triangle. Whenever you attack someone with a weapon triangle advantage, like swords versus axes, you disarm them, not only preventing their counterattack on this attack, but also on the next attack. So if there's a scary berserker, you can attack that berserker with a swordmaster, disarm him, and then attack him with another unit without fearing retaliation. The break mechanic certainly opens up a lot of gameplay opportunities, and the enemies will break you as well. This is cool because it means you can't just juggernaut your way through the game with a single powerful unit, because they can and will be broken. Unless you use an Armor Knight, because Armor Knights are completely immune to the break effect. I can absolutely tell you guys that Armor Knights feel the strongest that they have ever felt in any Fire Emblem game. The fact that they cannot be broken means that you can have them take on 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 plus enemies at once. On Maddening mode, I do hear that the AI is a lot smarter and it will actually run around your Armor Knight if they can't damage it, but on hard mode you can go absolute ham and send your Armor Knight into a horde of enemies and they'll just tank it. Just make sure you have some pure water ready in case you run into mages. But yeah, the break mechanic felt fun, and I really enjoyed it. The only thing that I miss a little bit is exploiting weapon triangle on enemy phase. For example, let's say you have a swordmaster, and there's a bunch of axe fighters coming at you. Equipping a sword and letting them attack you on enemy phase doesn't give you any intricate bonuses. You don't get any bonus to your avoid, they don't get any penalties to their hits. The only thing is that they won't be able to break you with their axes. I personally would have liked it if they'd added a little bit of a hit and avoid bonus with the weapon triangle. It doesn't have to be very big, maybe 5 or 10%, but the fact that you don't get any bonuses to hit and damage from the weapon triangle, I was a little bit sad about that. Now, I know that there are skills you can inherit that actually affects how much damage you take depending on your weapon triangle, but I'm just talking about the base mechanic itself. Don't get me wrong, break is a fun mechanic and it feels alright. It doesn't feel overly punishing or unfair when the enemy uses it against you, and it does feel pretty rewarding when you use it against the enemy. But I would have enjoyed a little bit of a bonus to hit and avoid. And then of course we have the Emblem Rings, the main mechanic of Engage and what this entire game revolves around. These rings are incredibly prevalent in this game, not only in the story but also in the gameplay itself. They're very strong, and you definitely need to take advantage of them to beat the game. Now, I played on hard mode, and I still felt like I had to use every single emblem ring at my disposal to their maximum effect to get through some of the chapters. In some maps, I actually popped my emblem rings too soon, and I didn't have access to their unique skills when I really needed them, so I found that I actually needed to conserve my engage meters a little bit. On Maddening mode, I estimate that this is going to be even more prevalent, and in some of the maps, the enemies will even use emblem rings against you, and you have to take that into account. And that ended up being some of the most challenging maps in the game. Now, the emblem rings are not just important for the skills that they provide in the here and now. If a character wields an emblem ring long enough, they can eventually learn skills that can be wielded without the rings. So the game definitely incentivizes you planning your route ahead and swapping the emblem rings around so that you can get useful skills on all your characters. And I think this is probably going to be one of the most fun things moving forward with Engage, and really delving deeply into the gameplay and making sure that the proper characters have the right amount of skills. And for that reason, I think that the emblem rings are a solid hit in terms of gameplay. However, as for me personally, I would have enjoyed it if the emblem rings were toned down a little bit. Not in terms of their power, but in terms of how many you get and how long they last. At some point during the late game, I felt that literally every single playable character I had was in constant engage mode all the time, and it got a little boring. It got a little repetitive. I needed it to get through some of the challenges, but I wish that I didn't. At some point, the rings stopped feeling special. They didn't feel like an amazing power boost when they happened. It just felt annoying when I didn't have the rings available, and that's not how a gameplay mechanic should feel. I would say that if you play your cards right, your characters will spend roughly 2/3 of their time being in engage mode, which I just think is too much. Now, this may just be due to my colorblindness too, but when every single playable character that I had was engaging, I had difficulties telling them apart because of their different hair colors and their engage meters. Again, this might just be a me thing, but I often had to stop myself and ask, okay, where is that character? I don't see this character. I need to sort through all these different engaged characters. And that to me felt a little silly. So, as I said, I think I would have enjoyed maybe 30 to 40% less focus on Emblem Rings, especially towards the late game where literally every single unit in your army has one. Now that brings me over to the next topic that I'd like to talk about, which is deployment slots. This game is stingy on its deployment slots, and I mean really stingy. In most of the mid-game chapters, you only get to deploy 8 units, which is absolutely laughable. Towards the end game, you do get 10, 12, and then I think you get 14 for the final map, which is kind of cool, but I always felt like I didn't have deployment slots to bring the characters that I wanted to bring, and I had to bench so many characters that I otherwise would have loved to train. And I think that's a big shame. Now, this doesn't necessarily surprise me because with Engage having small maps, that also means that there's less space for characters to move around, which means less deployment slots. But I personally felt like I just benched so many characters that I previously invested a lot of resources into, and that made me a little sad because you actually get some really cool characters in this game, including some older guys later on, which kind of feels like replacement units that are very solid, and I would have liked to take them for a spin and try them out, but I'd never had the deployment slots to test them out. Now, on a good note, this probably means that this game is a lot more Iron Man friendly than previous modern installments, and I'm very much looking forward to trying that out. But for me, I was just sad by how much I constantly had to bench previous characters that ended up falling off. And that is another thing that I'd also like to get into. This game scales very fast. Your Jagan, Vander, is very strong for the first few maps, but he falls off incredibly quickly because enemies scale up incredibly quickly, even on hard mode. I'm assuming on maddening mode it happens even faster. Enemies get a lot stronger, a lot quicker than you might expect, and if a unit falls off, it's very hard to get them back on the road again. I definitely think that this game has some scaling issues, where enemies will just outpace you if you don't level up your units well enough, and this can be a problem, especially if you're a little bit unlucky with RNG. Now, I understand that on maddening mode, level ups are actually fixed, so you shouldn't be screwed as much, but this could still have the same effect if you don't give as much experience as you should to a unit, for example. They can just lag behind, and then suddenly they can just become obsolete due to not getting enough EXP. So these are things that definitely worry me, and I'll look more into them on my later playthroughs, but these are at least problems that I discovered in my initial one. Now, while we are on the topic of scaling, there is one thing about this game that drives me up a wall, and I cannot for the life of me understand why the developers did it this way. And that's the fact that this game's optional paralogues do not scale to your party's level. There are some examples of level scaling in this game, the game does it sometimes, but for the Emblem Ring paralogues, their difficulty is set. The level is static. So that means that sometimes when you encounter certain paralogues, they are going to be way higher level than you, but you can also outlevel them. I had to go back and clear certain paralogues, and I was just able to breeze through them because the enemies were simply underleveled, and as a result the paralogues felt kinda boring. If they were scaled up to my level, I could have at least gained some experience from them and had a relatively good time. But instead, I just completely face-rolled most of them because I waited a while before clearing them. This doesn't make any sense to me. I think this has to be an oversight. This is something that I hope they fix in a future patch, because it just doesn't make sense to me that you'd lock certain rings later on in the game compared to others. I personally think that you should just have access to all the paralogues at some point during the game, and then you can just decide in which order you'll do them. I mean, the main story can be set, that's fine with me, but the paralogues really should be scaled up to your level. There's really no excuse not to do this. Now up next, I want to talk a little bit about the map design and the mission objectives. And on this end, I will say that the map design in this game is definitely better than it has been previously. I don't think that the map design and enemy placement in Engage is quite up to Conquest levels, but I think it gets pretty damn close. You're not lacking for any terrain to play around with, the maps feel good to play on, and this game doesn't reuse the same maps over and over like Tree Houses did, so that's at least very good to see. Now, as far as the mission objective variety, It's not fantastic. Most maps are either route or kill enemy boss. I would have liked to see slightly more varied objectives. In the late game, the maps certainly feel a little bit more different, but in most cases it really just comes down to kill the boss. Now, in terms of pure gameplay quality, I will say that the game starts out very strong. The early game feels fun as hell to play. However, the game takes a slight dip in quality in the mid-game during the Soul arc. To me, the Soul arc was by far the weakest point of the game. The maps felt very uninspired, very boring, and the gimmicks more often than not were just incredibly annoying. They borrowed the water temple gimmick of all things in one of the desert maps with like rising tides, and it just really served to slow the player down, and it didn't really feel integrated into the gameplay at all. It was just a major source of annoyance. And just all the Soul maps just didn't really feel that fun to me. Luckily, after the Soul arc was over, the game really kicked into high gear again, and it really was pretty much fun from start to finish. Towards the late game, I felt like the game got a little bit spammy with its reinforcements. There were some maps in the late game where it almost felt like the game threw infinite reinforcements at you until you killed the boss, which does push you forward, but it also feels a little BS-y sometimes. But overall, I will say the gameplay quality is consistent, it's good. With the exception of the Soul arc, every map feels fun and varied to play, although I do have to say, my goodness, does this game repeat the same bosses over and over again. I got so tired of fighting the Four Hounds towards the late game that I wanted to puke every time I heard their theme. I do not think I am over-exaggerating when I say that you face the Four Hounds probably 5 or 6 times at the least. Sadly, this game has a very bad case of, I've been defeated, but I can't fall here. I must make my retreat. This game does this a lot. While the enemies are pretty varied and it feels like the maps are different from one another, the bosses that you face definitely feels like it's repeated way too much. Now, another thing is the length of the boss fights themselves. Sometimes they can take a long time. In one particular boss fight, I was fighting the boss for literally 1 hour of real time. This is because in Engage, some bosses have multiple health bars, similar to the demonic beasts from Tree Houses. It varies a little bit, sometimes they start with 1 extra health bar, but into the late game they can have up to 3. And this means that it takes a long time to kill them, especially when you combine this with reinforcements and the fact that the bosses run back and forth a little bit. Now, while I certainly appreciate the fact that some bosses don't just get burned down and killed immediately, which has been a problem with previous Fire Emblem games, I feel like Engage goes a little bit overboard sometimes. Now, of course, you could say that this is a skill issue, and the reason why I took so long is because I simply weren't playing very well. And yeah, I can definitely take that criticism. I wasn't playing very well at times, I was very tired, and I was also on my first blind playthrough, so I was still learning the game, and maybe this will be better on my second playthrough, but I will say it almost felt a little bit too much at times. And then, of course, we have to talk about the turn wheel, or the Dragon Time Crystal, as the game calls it. I'm just gonna call it turn wheel, because it's what I'm used to saying. So, you guys probably know my opinion on the turn wheel mechanic at this point. I'm not overly fond of it. I think it's lazy game design. Oh, I know, if you don't like it, don't use it. I know I'm gonna get so many comments saying that. Look, I used the turn wheel too, and I'm pretty happy it's there most of the time. It saved me a lot of time resetting, and I definitely don't want to go back to you lose a unit in Fire Emblem, you have to play the map from the beginning if you want to save that character. No. I may be old school, but even I admit that this is way too tedious for modern Fire Emblem. I would have enjoyed some kind of battle save system maybe, or maybe some kind of semi-casual mode where a character can maybe die once but not twice during a map. I don't know. Anything other than just turning back time. I don't like the mechanic. I think it's just a poor gameplay mechanic, but I understand that it's there for a reason. There are some chapters where you will actually run out of turn wheel charges if you're not careful. It happened twice for me. The first time was on the Tiki Paralogue, which is one of the hardest Paralogues I've ever played in my life. I actually ran out of charges, and I was super nervous because that map took me like 2 to 3 hours to beat, and I really didn't want to reset. There was another chapter, I think it was chapter 17, where I actually lost Hortensia, and I just kept playing because I didn't want to expend any more turn wheel charges trying to rescue her, because I just knew that I would need them later on during the map, and indeed I did. I almost ran out of charges in that chapter as well. It's a very big chapter. So yeah, you can definitely run out of charges. You get 10 in total on Hard and Maddening, and I think on normal mode you just get infinite charges. You can use it as much as you like, so you're essentially playing on casual mode there. But on Hard and Maddening you get 10 charges, no more, no less. As long as you have the Dragon Time Crystal, that's the amount of charges you'll get, and no amount of side objectives will get you more charges, to my knowledge. They might introduce something via DLC, I don't know. And funnily enough, there is actually a short point during the game where your Dragon Time Crystal gets taken away from you, and there is a single chapter that you have to play for a little while without being able to turn wheel, which was very unexpected and also very cool, and a little nerve-wracking because you're very used to that mechanic at that point, and not being able to use it feels almost overly punishing, but that's very much supposed to be the point, I think. But I will say, despite the fact that I'm not overly fond of the mechanic, the game doesn't seem to be designed around it like Three Houses was. To my knowledge, there isn't a single ambush spawn in the game. The only time where the mechanic feels almost necessary is during Chapter 20, which has a very weird gimmick of the boss just randomly jumping you from out the fog and then teleporting away. So if you don't scout him out with torches and illuminate staves, he can literally just teleport in, kill one of your units, and then teleport out. And that mechanic, I think, would not have been very fun to face if it wasn't for the fact that you can turn back time. So that was like the only time where I was like, okay, yeah, the game definitely seems designed around turn wheel now, but otherwise, I think it's very doable to clear the game without it, if you play well. So if you want to do an Iron Man run, and I do believe some people are doing that right now, Iron Man run without turn wheel, I think it's very doable. In Three Houses, I would say that doing Iron Man Maddening without turn wheel sounds almost impossible due to the nature of the ambush spawns. But in this game, I haven't seen a single ambush spawn yet. I don't think they exist, and that's a very good thing. So while I'm not overly fond of the turn wheel mechanic, it doesn't seem to be a detriment to the game, and that is something that I very much appreciate. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the Somniel. I don't know about you guys, but the Somniel was the biggest thing that I was worried about going into Engage. I was very scared that it was going to turn out to be the Monastery 2.0 from Three Houses, a base that you spend a ludicrous amount of time in, and I am very happy to say that at least on hard mode, you can ignore the Somniel almost entirely. And I did, for the most part, during my run. I checked out some of the minigames, I played around with the base a little bit. I spent some time petting that stupid dog thing. I named it Cringe, just for the hell of it, because this game is really cringe sometimes. And yeah, I just completely ignored the Somniel for a big majority of my playthrough. I did some cooking, I would occasionally go and check out the market to see if there were some new items there, and I did some forging, but I just could not be bothered to run around picking up stuff. I didn't collect any animals, I didn't do any of the stupid minigames, and the game did not punish me at all for it. Now, I imagine if I played on Maddening mode and I actually wanted to be optimal, there's probably some more time I'd have to spend in the Somniel, you know, leveling up bond rings, doing the stupid training minigame, and making sure I do the correct cooking, and picking up every resource I can get my hands on, but it is not the Monastery 2.0. You can breathe a sigh of relief if this is something you've been worried about in regards to Engage. The Somniel feels a lot more like the My Base feature of Fire Emblem Fates than it does the Monastery. There's definitely more things to do there, and you can spend a pretty good amount of time in the Somniel if you want to. If you want to run around, pick up everything, talk to everyone, view all the supports, do all the little minigames, yeah, I can easily see you spending up to an hour there in between each chapter, but you really don't need to. At least not on hard mode. You really don't need to do it at all. All the things that are necessary to do for the chapters, like cooking and maybe the training minigame and just running around picking up things, I believe you can get that done within 5 to 10 minutes if you're fast. All the other stuff, in my opinion, is completely optional and not necessary. You don't have to do it. So I personally think they struck a perfect balance between the gameplay and the My Base feature. It's not very prevalent at all. If you want to spend extra time in there, you can, but it's absolutely not needed. And this makes me more happy than I can possibly say, because this was the one thing that I thought maybe would come in the way of my enjoyment of this game personally, and I'm very happy to announce that it's not the case. This is not the Monastery 2.0, it's not even close. It's actually a really well-crafted My Base feature, and I like it a lot. Now, that being said, there are things about the Somniel which annoys me a lot, and one of them is the loading times. There is a 10 to 12 second loading timer when you go between two areas, and that gets old really fast, especially when you go down to the arena or in to check your rings. You first have to go into the room, which is a 10 to 12 second loading timer, and then you have to go back out again, which is another 10 to 12 second loading timer, and then maybe you go like, oh, I forgot something, I need to go check on the ring room again, and then it's another 10 to 12 second loading timer, and yeah, that got old very quick. I may not have liked the Monastery of Three Houses, but I really enjoyed how there were no loading times in it. It was essentially just being loaded in as I ran around it. I really wish the Somniel could have used a similar system. Now, there was one funny incident on stream that made me want to firebomb the Somniel, and that was when it was time for me to marry someone. Now, you see, the cast of Engage is actually so big that there's not room for everyone inside the base. Kind of similar to Fire Emblem Fates, units just randomly gets loaded into the base. Sometimes they hang around, other times they're in shops and in other facilities. But you actually have to re-roll the Somniel if there's a certain person you need to talk to. For example, if you need to give them gifts, they might not actually be present in your base. So you have to go into the Somniel, check who's there, and then if they're not there, you have to go out and then go in again or go to bed. This happened to me when I was trying to marry Louis, and Louis just wouldn't spawn. And I had to go in and out through the Somniel at least 20 times before he showed up. And it was the most frustrating thing ever. And when I finally got him to spawn, I gave him all of my gifts, but it wasn't enough, so I have to run back and forth between the shop that sells gifts, buy a bunch of stuff, didn't know how much I needed, run back to Louis, give him a bunch of gifts. Okay, it wasn't enough. I had to run back to the shop and then back to Louis and then back to the shop and then back to Louis. And it was absolutely horrible. I can safely say that getting married and engaged was one of the hardest things I did in the game. It took me, I think, 45 minutes to an hour. And it was so damn frustrating. So that is like a major design flaw with the Somniel. The fact that if you're waiting for a specific person to spawn in it, that is absolutely ludicrous. You should be able to open a roster with all your guys and then click on them and select Give Gift. You should not have to try and make them randomly spawn in the base. Seems like a massive oversight. And while I'm on to oversights, I also would like to say that the engrave feature, you know, when you go in and you like attach a ring to a specific weapon, it doesn't actually show you which rings are attached to which weapon. You have to actually go out and manually check your weapons and then go back to the engrave menu. And it doesn't even tell you which rings are used and which are not used. You kind of have to keep track of it yourself. Again, this just seems like a massive oversight and something that they should have included in the UI. And this is something that they can probably patch in later. Another thing that really annoyed me about the Somniel was whenever I was leveling up the bond level of my rings, I could skip the fights themselves, but I couldn't skip the introduction to the fights. So, you know, whenever I had to level up a ring to level 5, level 10, level 15, I would have to watch those stupid introductions of the characters going like, I am this character, haha, I'm getting ready to fight, and the other character going, oh, should I really be here? I don't know if I should really fight, guys, haha. And there's like, and then I can skip the fight, and then I have to like skip through a bunch of screens of them talking to their emblems and whatnot. I would have been so grateful if they could have just cut all of that out and just allow me to just hit level up bond and then give me a message whether or not the fight succeeded or failed. Just give me some means to skip through it fast, because when you have to level up like 5 emblem rings to bond level 10, it feels like all you do is just press the A button and then start to skip through the various scenes. And it takes a lot of time and it gets very old very fast, especially when you have to do it a lot. So that's something that they could definitely patch in, I think. I really hope they do, because that was like definitely the biggest source of annoyance for me as I was playing the game. Otherwise, I think the Somniel is fine. I think it's a great base. You know, barring the loading times and the unskippable scenes, I think it's a very well executed my base feature. And I do not think that it detracts from the enjoyment of the game at all, which means I'm giving it a big thumbs up. So the final gameplay related thing I'd like to talk about are the characters themselves, how they feel, whether or not all of them are useful or not, and like generally speaking, the power level between various characters. I'm going to talk a little bit more about which characters I like to design and story-wise and personality-wise a little bit later on in the video. But for now, I'd like to say that every character that joins your party, and you do get a lot of them, they do seem to join at a very rapid rate. Every single character feels like they have some kind of unique niche, and for the most part, they had a good, strong introduction into the game. Louis' introduction as an Armor Knight is one of the best I've ever seen. He literally tanks half the map and is just amazing. And then you have Eddie, the archer, who just one-shots Pegasus Knights in her joining chapter, and she does fantastic damage off the bat. So for the most part, the game does a very good job introducing new characters. There are some that feel like complete duds, like for me, for example, Fogato was one of the least impressive characters I've ever seen. He joined during a desert chapter where his mobility was kind of limited, and he didn't consistently double anything. There weren't many flyers for him to shoot down, and the lack of Kanto on mounted units at base means that he just kind of felt like a really bad archer. Like, his mobility didn't really feel like an asset. This could be very subjective, obviously. I know I'm gonna get a ton of comments like, oh, Forgato, my best unit, Mengs, how could you say bad thing about Forgato? These are just my experiences, okay? He had a really, really bad first impression on me. And there was another unit too, I think the Panette, the Berserker, she also felt so incredibly underwhelming to me. Swordmasters and Berserkers do not get crit bonus in this game. Now, I kind of get it, the crit bonus is really good, but I really miss it. And to me, Berserkers just kind of feel like gimped warriors now, and I really don't like it. So yeah, Panette, a pre-promoted Berserker, that's usually very strong, but she just couldn't hit anything. She wasn't really fast enough to double a lot for me, and she just felt incredibly underwhelming. She was also made of tinfoil paper. I felt like every enemy just killed her. So some units just felt very weak, others felt very strong. I will say though, most personal skills in this game feel crap. I really don't know why the personal skills are so underpowered. Maybe they didn't want personal skills to really dominate, but I feel like they should be an important part of the character's toolkit. Don't get me wrong, there's some really good personal skills, but for the most part, most of them just feel very forgettable. But overall, you get a healthy dose of new characters joining you, and most of the units do feel like they have a niche. In this game, by the way, levels are infinite. We're back to second seals resetting your level like they did in Awakening, so there's absolutely no limit to how good you can make a character, and skirmishes and optional battles are available to anyone. You can also go to the Tower of Trials in the Somniel and just sign up for some Tempest Trials where your units won't even die. So the experience ceiling is infinite in this game, just like in Awakening. You can play around with it to your heart's content and have a unit just cap out every single stat. So at the end of the day, units can get as good as you want them to be. I don't think there's a single unit in this game that is simply unusable. The only character for me that feels a little underwhelming right now is Vander, the Jagan. I really wanted him to stay a little bit more relevant into the game. Like, by chapter 3 or 4, he's already getting doubled on hard mode. I assume it's even worse on maddening mode. And yeah, he's tanky enough to take the double attacks, but it's still kind of annoying. So anyway, I'm not really going to dwell on this topic for a very long time because I've just played through the game once, and I didn't even use a third of the characters. So my experience with many of these units is highly subjective, and, you know, I just haven't really had the time to use all of them, so I can't really speak much more on this topic. But overall, I was happy with the amount of playable characters that I got and how they felt right off the bats. So now, with the gameplay covered, it's time to get into the good stuff. The story, and this is where I'm gonna get a little bit more critical. This is also where I will start to drop some spoilers on the main story. I'm not going to spoil like the ending just yet, but I'm going to talk about stuff that happens during the story. So if you really are allergic to spoilers, this is your cue to click off the video, because I will be talking about stuff that happens during the story itself. And let me just start by saying this. If you enjoy the story of Engage, then good for you. Just because I don't like it doesn't mean you have to not like it. And I'm not judging you that hard, maybe just a little bit. but okay, to be serious here, I really think that the story of Engage is lacking in so many areas. And look, there's nothing wrong with enjoying a simple story. Fates and Awakening both had very simple stories. Engage, though, is bad in a different way. You know, with Awakening, the story was just kind of bland, in my opinion. And with Fates, we know that they cut 75% of the script, so the game itself just ended up feeling very hollow. They didn't have a lot of time to delve deep into the game. The world building, for example, felt very lacking. With Engage, there's plenty of world building. There's plenty of characterization. I just think that it's really poorly done. And I spoke to Clockinator, one of my friends. He's also the lead writer for Andaron Saga. He writes professionally for a living. And he told me that he thinks that the developers of Engage, they just wanted to make a fun Fire Emblem game to play, and they didn't really care that much about the story. They made the game first, and then they hashed out a story later. And I think he's very on the money about this, because the more I look at the story of Engage, the more I just see a story that wasn't put a lot of effort into. Now, why do I say this? Well, it's just a very simple story from start to finish. Not only did they not put a lot of effort into it, but they also just straight up kind of copied it from Awakening. I mean, just look at it. You wake up surrounded by people, you have amnesia, and then you find out that you're related to the bad guy. I mean, it's literally just a copy of Awakening's story. Except that instead of being a tactician, you're a divine dragon. I mean, just the entire structure of the story itself is just a copy of the story of Awakening, with bells and whistles added onto it. The corrupted are the risen. Sombreron is Grima. Alar is Robin. Even the continent itself reminds me of the world of Awakening, and the conclusion of the story itself too is very similar to that of Awakening. It's clear to me that they just didn't spend a lot of effort on the story. It's not where their main focus lied. They just wanted to make a cool Fire Emblem game, and they just added a kind of like a half-baked story on top of it. I mean, this game just does all the tropes that I really dislike. It has overly cheesy villains who overly monologue and tell the players about their plans when they absolutely should not. It has avatar worship of the absolute worst kind. People treat you like a celebrity, and yeah, I get that the Divine Dragon is kind of a big deal in Ilios, but do they really have to react like that all the time and tell you that you're the absolute best and the Divine Dragon is so cool and we love you and we kiss your feet and worship the ground you walk on? It gets very tiresome for me personally. One of the reasons why I don't like avatar worship is because it robs you of the hero's journey. Now, if you don't know what the hero's journey is, it's a very common trope in storytelling. You as the hero need to have a journey. And in order for that journey to feel meaningful, you kind of have to start at the bottom and work your way upwards. When you start out already being worshipped and admired by everyone around you, it robs you of that journey because you've kind of already achieved herodom. Now take another Fire Emblem character, Ike for example. He starts out as a lowly mercenary, he's not even a noble, and he has to work hard and overcome many challenges and prove himself to turn into the man we see him at the end of Radiant Dawn. During his story in Path of Radiance, he even finds himself suddenly having to lead his father's mercenary company, and during that time, 2 of your playable characters just straight up leave the company because they don't want to take orders from a green little brat. And then Ike had to prove himself, and only once he did prove himself did these 2 characters actually come back and rejoin his company. That would never happen with Alar in Engage. Everyone just loves you, and the story sets you up to be a god from the get-go, and for me, that just feels hollow. It feels like I didn't earn it. I'd like to go from 0 to hero in a video game, thank you very much. And you know, not everyone is like me. I get that. That's completely fine. If you enjoyed the avatar worship, then good for you. But for me, it felt extremely hollow, and it just completely robs me of any character arc and makes me just not care about the main character at all. The story of Engage at its very core is a glorified MacGuffin hunt. The Emblem Rings are pretty much the objective, and we have to gather them to destroy the Fell Dragon. It's a very simple plot, and simple doesn't necessarily have to mean bad, but the game just really fails to deliver a compelling narrative to me for so many reasons. First off is the overwhelming amount of cringe in the story, and I know that cringe is subjective, but to me, almost 50% of all the scenes were just overbearing cringe. Take the introduction to Alchrist, for example, which starts with him shooting an arrow at you and looking kind of badass, and then once he realizes you're the Divine Dragon, there's this extremely over-the-top sequence where he jumps into the air and lands on his knees and goes, sorry, 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 sorry. And little scenes like these can be cute if they don't dominate the gameplay, but I felt like there were just too many of them. And I just felt like this was a very overarching theme with so many characters that got introduced in Engage. So many of them just felt over the top and kooky and weird. One of the most baffling moments to me was when the character Amber got introduced. His gimmick, seemingly, is that he talks like a 7-year-old. And I just remember sitting there going, can we have a normal character join the party, please? Like, I feel like all of these characters are either insane, kooky, weird, eccentric, or just bizarre. And at some point, it just got too much for me. I just really wanted a normal character to join the roster. And don't get me wrong, there are some quote-unquote normal ones, like Citrine, for example. I really like her. She seems like one of the more down-to-earth characters. But then you have characters like Hortensia, who is just so over-the-top cartoonish. I mean, she's literally dressed like a clown. For what reason? I don't know. So many of the characters in Engage are just overly weird for no reason at all. It's never really explained why they look the way they do. They just do for some reason. Why does Yunaka have Christmas ornaments in her hair? I don't know. She just does. Maybe it's explored through her supports. I don't know. I didn't watch them all. I have no interest in doing that. But yeah, the characters in Engage feel very over the top and weird. And if you ask me, this was done as a substitute instead of actually making them into compelling characters. Because, you know, sure, you can sit down and you can think long and hard about a character that you're making. You know, why are they here? What are their motivations? What are their ambitions? What are their goals? Why are they with the main character? What are they hoping to get out of this journey? Stuff like that. These are difficult questions to ask, and it takes a long time to write a really compelling character. Or you can just say, lol, character has weird thing in here and speak funny. and that's going to be their entire personality. And now you have created a character that is maybe memorable, but not very deep. And I feel like Engage does this a lot. They introduce some weird, kooky, over-the-top character with some very defining character traits, and they shove this trait into your face at every opportunity they get so that you remember it, so that the character stands out, and then maybe if you look into their supports a little, you kind of get to know them a little bit better. In my opinion, I don't like this argument that in order to understand a character, you have to watch, like, 3 hours of their support conversations. I think support conversations should be optional because they are optional. Not everyone will see a support conversation. And if I have to watch all of a character's support conversations to know what kind of a character they are, then that's fundamentally a writing fail, in my opinion. I think that supports should expand upon what is already there. A character should have a chance to shine in the main story. If they cannot, then I think that the writers are failing. And I get it, it's Fire Emblem. Not every character can get time in the spotlight. There's a lot of characters and only so much screen time, but I do feel that most of the engaged characters really struggle to stand out personality-wise, and even when you view some of their supports, they still aren't very good characters. A very good example of this is Goldmary. I love Goldmary's design. She is gorgeous, and not only that, her English voice actor is the same one who does Louise in Heroes, and I love her voice. And then I decided to watch a couple of Goldmary's supports, and I have never gone from loving a character to hating a character so quickly. Literally, in her first support, she tries to whisper ASMR into Alar's ear, and then in their B support, she's crying because she realizes she can't get any more gorgeous than she is now? Okay, I can appreciate some comedy, but this is not how you write a compelling character. To me, just from those two supports, Goldmary comes off like a complete and utter narcissist, and I just ended up not liking her at all based on those support conversations. Maybe she has some other good ones. I did watch a couple of her with Rosado that weren't that bad, but man, her supports with the Avatar, whew, those are some of the worst ones I've seen ever. I literally could not stand her after that. But yeah, overall, I will say that the writing of Engage, and especially in regards to their characters, it feels like Awakening Syndrome times 100, where characters are very one-note. There are exceptions. There are some characters I really like for example, the aforementioned Citrine. Diamant was pretty cool too. And of course, I really liked Louis. I thought he was a very charming, dapper fellow. And another character that I didn't think I'd like initially, but that actually ended up growing on me, was Pandreo. I actually kind of liked how he was a holy man, but he also enjoyed partying, but not in a degenerate way. He wasn't like a hit on girls kind of character. He wasn't a sane archetype who just wanted to go partying and hit on girls. He just liked partying and dancing and also praying. I thought it was a pretty cool combination, and even though his hair looks awful, I think that Pandreo ended up being a character that surprised me a lot and actually grew on me over the course of the story. Playable characters aside, next up I really have to talk about the Four Hounds. They are sort of like the main villains of the game. They're definitely the ones you face the most. And even though, you know, the Fell Dragon Sombrero Man is the final big battle of the game, and the Dark Priest Hyacinth plays a antagonistic role early on, it's the Four Hounds who you really end up fighting for most of the mid to late game. And the Four Hounds, they are not very memorable, at least to me. First of all, you face them way too many times. By the 5th or 6th time, I was literally screaming whenever they showed up on screen because I was so tired of fighting against them. But the Four Hounds just fundamentally have some really big problems to them. I really just don't understand why the Four Hounds are together in the first place. They talk about being a family and whatnot, but we don't really see them bonding that much with each other. Towards the end of the game, when they start dying, you get some nice scenes with Sephia and Gris holding hands together and stuff like that. But the problem I have with the Four Hounds is that the game only tries to make you care about them after they're dead. You don't get much incentive to care about them before that, and that to me is a fundamental storytelling fail. I also just think they lack cohesion. You know, they all look so very different from one another. Why are they together? What is the glue that holds them together? They seem to mostly just be together because they are evil. And I really have to ask, aside from Sephia, who has a motivation, she wants a baby from Sombrero Man, what is the main driving force of the Four Hounds? What do they want? Aside from just serving the Fell Dragon or whatnot. Why is Mauvier there? Mauvir has a thing for Veyle. He wants to protect Veyle, but he doesn't need to be among the Four Hounds to serve her. He could just serve her as her personal knights. Why is he with Sephia and Gris and, you know, the lolly girl? I forget her name. To me, they just seem like four random evil characters who are just shoehorned together in a group for the sake of being in a group. It's clear that they're borrowing from the Four Fangs from FE7, but I just don't really get why the Four Hounds are together, at least not Mauvir. Mauvir seems like an honorable guy. I don't really understand why he's with the others. I mean, he does end up joining the players after a while, but I don't understand why he's in the group to begin with. It doesn't make any sense to me. And it's particularly puzzling towards the end of the game, where you fight Sephia and Gris as they're guarding one of those crystals, and basically at this point, evil Felddragon Man has left, and he wants to go over to other worlds to conquer them or whatnot. And you have to ask yourself, why is Sephia and Gris guarding the crystal at that point? I mean, Sombrero Man is going to leave, right? It's pretty much no point in doing that. We know Sephia wants a baby, that's her motivation for following Sombrero, but she hasn't gotten that yet. So why is she following him now that he's about to leave their world? And, you know, like, even after you kill them, Sephia's like, yeah, why did we do this? Like, oh my god, it feels like we died for nothing. And I'm just sitting here going like, yeah, you kind of did. And it's a good example of the game just needing them to be villains for the sake of putting something in front of the player. Villains need to have motivations. They need to actually have a reason for doing what they're doing. And it seems to me like the game just goes, yeah, well, they're evil because they're evil. And they stand in your way because you're the good guys. Another thing that the Four Hounds do, especially Sephia, that drives me up a wall, is how they keep explaining things to the player. Sephia is known for obnoxiously monologuing the plans of the Four Hounds to the player, constantly telling them their next move, what they seek to do, and what they hope to achieve. And the only reason I can see her doing this is just to monologue to the player. They're using Sephia as an exposition device by making her talk to the player so that they know what the villains are up to. But it makes no sense for her to reveal their plans. She should really just shut up and just execute her plans. But again, the writers of Engage didn't really put a lot of thought into this. They're just using villains to monologue and exposition rather than actually thinking about what it makes sense for the villains to tell the player. I also haven't mentioned Veyle much because honestly, she wasn't a very interesting character to me. It was a classic example of good person mind controlled by the villain, which to me is not a very exciting plot point. You know, this whole like dual personality that she has. Because while I can appreciate a good betrayal arc, it doesn't really appeal to me when that betrayal is driven by mind control magic, because that absolves the character of any action, you know? Why is Veyle evil? Well, it's because Sombrero Man mind control her to be evil, and then put like an e-girl accessory on her head so that she'd remain evil. It's not about Veyle and her ambitions and her motivations, or about Veyle being conflicted because of her inner turmoil or whatnot. It's not that Veyle has dual loyalties to the player and Sombrero Man. That would have actually been a kind of an interesting angle to explore. Maybe if Veyle was a Felddragon who felt like she wanted to be friends with Alar, but she also had sort of like a loyalty to her father, that could have been a very cool avenue to explore for a villain. And then maybe, you know, towards the end she has to make a choice. Does she follow her father or does she follow the Divine Dragon? And then maybe she ends up following the Divine Dragon because of the kindness that you showed to her. That's not Veyle's arc at all. With Veyle, it's simply just a matter of she's actually a good character, but she's being controlled by evil dragon magic. And to me, that is just so much less compelling than a character who actually has an internal struggle with their own emotions, not just being controlled by a third party into doing evil stuff. It's lazy writing, and it doesn't really appeal to me a whole lot. Also, why do they show off Veyle's feet so much? There's like 3 different CGs where they zoom in on our feet. I mean, seriously, they're doing that on purpose, and it's really creepy. Another thing that the story does which really pisses me off is just having scenes that straight up make no sense. There is a certain point during the game where it looks really bad for the playable characters. In front of us we have the Felddragon in all of his terrible glory, and then behind us we have the Four Hounds, and we are surrounded inside a church with nowhere to go. And this is pretty early on in the story, so we're still very underleveled, and there's no way we can fight the Four Hounds in our current state. Additionally, they've stolen our Emblem Rings, so this should just be game over, right? We're dead. How the hell are we gonna get out of this one? I thought of many possibilities, maybe some kind of Deus Ex Machina, maybe some kind of divine intervention, you know, anything that would get us out of this trap. How does the game explain it? With a fade to black. I'm not joking. It does a fade to black, and then in the next scene, they're outside the church, with the Four Hounds chasing them from behind. And this just doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, how did they get out of the church? They were literally surrounded on all sides. They should have just straight up died there. But the game just doesn't put a lot of effort into its storytelling. It just jumps from one scene to another with a fade to black, which to me is just such lazy storytelling. And there are just so many examples of weird scenes in this game that doesn't make any sense. There's like scenes where corrupted are attacking us, they're standing right in front of us, surrounding us, and then the characters have a nice little dialogue while the corrupted are just standing around doing nothing, just waiting for us to finish our dialogue. It feels so bad and over the top comical, it completely takes me out of the game. If the corrupted are supposed to be viewed as any kind of threat, scenes like that just makes them look like a joke. And I get it, they're corrupted, they exist as fodder for the player to earn experience on. But you can still kind of try and make them a little bit intimidating. I mean, they sure tried at the start of the game to make them look scary, with some really gorgeous cinematics, but then towards the end of the game, they're pretty much just treated as a joke. And so many of the game's villains are just treated as jokes, in my opinion, and it just doesn't really work. Now, next, I would like to talk a little bit about the main villain, Sombreron, the Fell Dragon. He's just Grima 2.0. He's got a fair bit more dialogue than Grima did in Awakening, and basically his motivations are that he used to have an emblem ring, the first emblem or whatnot, and he lost his emblem, and then he got sad, and now he doesn't want friends because friends abandon you, so he's stronger alone, ha ha ha. He doesn't need any friends, he's gonna be fine on his own, guys. I may not be explaining it very well, but that's kind of what I got from my first playthrough. It's pretty much just the power of friendship versus the power of solitude, and they overcome him with the power of friendship by telling him, yeah, bonds can be broken and really sucks when friends are bad, but friends are also important, and it's like the most overused trope in storytelling ever. I've seen this story so many times in so many different video games. It's literally the least original angle you can pull. Just like, oh, look at us, we have friends, and we're fighting against this guy who doesn't have friends, who just wants to be on his own. I hate this trope. It's so lazy. And while I do like the design of Sombreron, he looks kind of badass in his Viper Dragon form. I think he looks really cool. I just think that as a villain, he's incredibly uninteresting. I will say I felt a little bit of sympathy for him towards the end, when he finally reconnects with his emblem. It's never really explained why he reconnects with his emblem towards the end. Like, why did the emblem take so long to reach out to him? Did he need to get pummeled to death first? I don't know. The game doesn't really want to explain that to us, but yeah, I will say as a villain, he's fairly weak, and I didn't leave a very big impression on me. But hey, he looked cool, at least. Alright, so I feel like at this point I've ranted a lot about the story, but I have a little bit left in me before I continue onwards. I know I'm going to get a bunch of angry comments about this. People really don't like it when I attack the story in a Fire Emblem game, but I don't care. If you watch this long, you probably think it's entertaining. So, one thing that this game does, which frustrates me to no end, is dragging out scenes, and this is really prevalent, especially when your mom dies. I mean, it's such a joke at this point that every parental figure in Fire Emblem has to get killed at some point, but the amount of time that this game spends on its scenes sometimes, it's just unbearingly bad. The scene where your mom dies could probably be cut by 75% and nothing would change. It would actually be an improvement. She is dying in your arms and the scene just goes on and on and on and on, and it just never stops. And it's like the game is trying to force you to care about this character that you met 20 minutes ago. And then towards the late game, she gets revived by the bad guy and you have to fight her again. And then when she dies a second time, you have to go through the whole thing again, like another dragged out death scene, and it's almost comical at that point. The game tries really hard to make you care sometimes by simply dragging out scenes. Again, I spoke to Clockinator about this, the lead writer for Andaran Saga, and he had an absolutely hilarious insight that the writers of Engage look as if they got paid per word they put into the script. So they wrote a very long script with very little substance, and some of the scenes just drag on forever and ever and ever and ever. And this was extremely prevalent during the mother death scene, obviously, but also in a lot of other scenes. And one part of the game where I think this is very prevalent is when the game explains to the viewer in great detail when it really doesn't need to. There's a segment during the story where they go back in time and they meet past Alar. And this is not a terrible concept. It's a little bit of a weird paradox because Alar meeting themselves in the future resulted in Alar becoming good, which is why Alar exists in the future. Again, it's a bit of a time paradox, but I don't necessarily hate it. But then once they actually go back in time, they don't realize it at first. The characters immediately begin to explain, oh, we must have gone back in time. That is why we can see Alar over there, evil Alar. That's because that's Alar 1,000 years ago. And it's like, it actually would have been kind of cool if the game just shut up and didn't explain it, and we just kind of had to piece it together ourselves. Could have maybe explained it to us at the end of the chapter for those who weren't able to get it, but I think it would have been cool if you just gone back in time, met a different Alar, and the game just doesn't explain it to you. And then maybe some of the more clever players will go, oh, maybe this is actually past Alar. That would have been a really cool revelation, but the game doesn't trust you enough to actually come to your own conclusions. It has to over-explain everything to you as soon as something happens. Oh, I bet Veyle is evil because of blah blah blah. That's because she's being controlled. Why don't you just shut up and let the player actually come to their own conclusions? But the problem is the story doesn't respect your intelligence enough for that. It has to spoon feed you all the exposition and information immediately, because otherwise you might be left in the dark, and the game doesn't want to risk you doing that, because then you might disconnect from the story. But in doing that, it already disconnects you from the story, because when you're being spoon-fed everything like an absolute idiot, it doesn't really make you want to invest in the story. At least that's the effect it had on me. But what's even more weird about Engage is that while it has a habit of over-explaining things to the player, the one thing it refuses to explain is exactly what the Emblem Rings are. The Emblem Rings, to me, were very poorly incorporated into the story. The emblems themselves weren't very interesting. They very seldom had personalities or opinions. They were just kind of exposition devices. And there's this one cute scene where they all gather around to talk with each other, which I really liked. But otherwise, they're just kind of background footage. They're just hanging around doing whatever they're told, and they kind of act like tools, and they're very much treated that way, even though the game tries very hard to establish some kind of relationship between you and them. But one thing I was left wondering after playing the game was just what the hell are these rings? Like, who are they? Are they fragments of the old heroes? Are they the spirits of the heroes in the afterlife? Do they do anything when they're not following you around? Are they just Pokemon? Do they exist inside their Pokeballs, which are the rings? How are they created, and what are they exactly? When they're not following you into battle, do they do stuff on their own? Do they go back to their own worlds? These are details that I think would have been kind of interesting to explore, and the game does give some hints, but I personally am left kind of thinking that they didn't really want to delve much into this. The emblems are just kind of there because they're cool. Don't ask questions about it. I mean, it's pretty obvious that they have already lived their lives because the emblems talk about the events of their games in certain scenes, like they happened long ago. So I'm guessing that what the emblems really are is kind of like a memory of the hero gathered into a ring. They're kind of like a fragment of the hero as they used to be, but they're not the heroes themselves. And I do think this is mentioned briefly during the game itself. They're not actually the heroes, they're just like fragments of the heroes. But I find it kind of odd that while the game seemingly wants to over-explain everything to death, the main focus of the game, which are the Emblem Rings, are left very much ambiguous. They don't really want to delve deeply into what the Emblem Rings are and how they function. Aside from the rings being very powerful and being important to the plot because they are MacGuffins, I found that the emblems' role in the story itself is very weak. I didn't really think they added that much. I can't think of a single time when an emblem actually had any lines that made me go, ooh, that's kind of cool. You know, it was kind of nice to see Sigurd and Roy and all the other characters that I enjoy, but I didn't really feel like they impacted the story all that much, and for the most part they just felt like nostalgia plot devices. And let me just tell you, the nostalgia definitely worked for me. When I went back and I played the Sigurd and the Roy Paralogue, I was definitely nostalgic, you know, listening to that remix of the music, seeing the old maps again. I had fun. It worked on me. Like, nostalgia successful. But all it really served to do was making me want to go back and play those games again. I didn't really think it added all that much to Engage, but hey, that may just be my opinion. You guys may disagree with that. Now, there are so many things I would like to rant about in regards to this story, but this is turning into a very long rant at this point. I think I'm going to wrap it up. But there are a bunch of things that I would love to touch more upon in the future, like, for example, how Alar is killed and resurrected as a corrupted and then revived again. how the game keeps taking your rings away and then giving them back to you immediately, or how it just doesn't want to let things breathe. It resolves any conflict immediately. You know, when Alar finds out that she's actually the child of Lord Sombreron, immediately in the same scene, her friends stand around her and like encourage her, like, no, you are actually good and blah blah blah, and then she doesn't even get a chapter to brood, which I just think was sorely needed. But yeah, the story just has to resolve itself immediately. It cannot take any time to develop itself, and this just shows to me that the writers were very impulsive and also very impatient. They just kind of wrote in whatever direction they felt like writing at the time without really thinking things out ahead. And again, there's so many things I can rant about with the story, but I think it's getting a little bit too much now, and I'll rather save it for another video. But for me personally, the story fails fundamentally on so many levels. It is terrible Fire Emblem writing at its worst, and I really don't think many other stories come close to being as bad as this one. Was it enjoyable at times? Sure. Did I enjoy some of the characters? Absolutely. Just because something is bad doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. Hell, there's nothing better than eating a double cheeseburger at McDonald's. It's not good for you, and it's objectively very bad food, but it tastes great. Everyone enjoys fast food at times, and that's what this story is. It's fast food, but it's enjoyable, and you can absolutely enjoy a bad story. But for me, I just wanted to point out some of the aspects of it that made it lacking, in my opinion. And I will say that if Engage actually had a good, compelling story, it would probably be my favorite Fire Emblem game of all time. I think it's a little bit sad that modern Fire Emblem puts so little effort into their writing, because I really do think that a good story is important for some people. I understand that at the end of the day, good design and gameplay and fun mechanics is what they're prioritizing, but when I think about the fact that someone got paid to write this story, I mean, the day before Engage came out, I was relaxing a little bit by playing other video games, and I played a little bit of God of War Ragnarok, and then I played some The Witcher 3. And, you know, going from those stories, which are some of the best stories ever told in video games, to Engage, I mean, it was bad. It really put things into perspective for me, just to put it that way. I mean, I really don't understand why we can't have both, why we can't have good gameplay and good story. But who knows, maybe when the future Genealogy of the Holy War remake comes out, we'll actually see some solid storytelling again. So yeah, I think we've reached the end of this video. To summarize my thoughts, Engage is a fantastic game. I know I've spent a lot of time ranting on the story, but the gameplay truly is impeccable, and I'm very excited to try my second playthrough of the game on Maddening. One of the things I definitely want to try out is a ringless run. And what I mean by that is just a run where I don't equip the Emblem Rings. I can still use them to inherit skills and use them to engrave items and whatnot, I just cannot equip or engage with them during battle. I don't know if this is doable on Maddening, but I think it's very possible on Hard. Overall, I think that this is a fantastic Fire Emblem game. I think we're very lucky to have gotten a very good one in terms of gameplay. You know, I wish that the story could be equally good, but I also understand that, despite the fact that I didn't enjoy it, many of you did. And you know what? Good for you guys. I'm happy for you. Truly I am. If you enjoy the story of Engage and you think it's amazing, then all the power to you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. But for me, personally, it left a lot to be desired. But hey, I'm still going to enjoy this game a lot in the time to come. I look forward to playing it again. I look forward to Iron Manning it. I look forward to making videos about it. And I hope you guys enjoyed my first reaction review of this game, even though it's just from the perspective of someone who's beaten the game once. I assume at this point there's probably a lot of you who have beaten it twice, or maybe even 3 times, or more than that. So, you know, if my opinions are a little bit uninformed, then it's just because I haven't played the game that much yet. But hopefully you found some value in this video. If you agree or disagree with me about any of the points in this video, please leave them in the comment section below. I love reading your input, I love seeing your criticism, even when you call me a bald stupid egg. Go ahead, call me a bald stupid egg, I don't mind. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this long review. Let me know what you thought about it, give it a like, and subscribe for more Engage content. My name is Emblem Rings, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye!